So you may have noticed that Gareth Davies has taken every opportunity in recent interviews to claim that he was right about the Tyson Fury-Francis Ngannou fight. He says that he predicted that Ngannou would be dangerous for the first 10 minutes of the fight, and that he was basically bang on about that and everybody else was wrong. The inference that Gareth Davies is making here is that people were wrong to criticize Tyson Fury for taking that fight in light of the trouble that Fury had against Ngannou in the ring. But of course, what Gareth Davies is doing here is trying to present things out of context. The reason that so many of us were critical of Tyson Fury fighting Ngannou is because here we have a man who not only claims to be the best heavyweight of his generation, but also the greatest heavyweight of all time. And he was being called out by a number of top heavyweight contenders, people like Frank Sanchez and Martin Bakole, who were ready and willing to fight him in the summer. And instead of taking those challenges, as you should, as a world heavyweight champion, a man who claims to be the best in the division and the greatest of all time, he instead takes on a guy who'd never had a boxing match before in his life. That is not acceptable, Gareth Davies, irrespective of how the fight turned out. It's a fight that Tyson Fury shouldn't have been having in the first place. Now, if Tyson Fury had already cleaned out the division, if he'd already fought everybody there was to fight, as was the case when Muhammad Ali fought that Japanese wrestler at the back end of his career, then you could say, okay, Tyson Fury having a novelty fight against an MMA guy, we can accept it. But that wasn't the case with Fury. There are so many fighters that he hasn't faced. He hasn't faced most of the guys in the top 10 of the current heavyweight rankings. And of course, at that point, the undisputed fight wasn't signed either, and we didn't know whether it was ever going to happen. So that was the context within which we were criticizing Tyson Fury for taking the Francis Ngannou fight, Gareth Davies. The fact that Ngannou gave Fury trouble doesn't all of a sudden justify the fact that Fury took the fight. No, because if Ngannou was giving him that much trouble, how much trouble might Martin Bakole or Frank Sanchez have given him? And of course, going back to what Gareth Davies said prior to the Fury Ngannou fight, he said Ngannou will be dangerous for 10 minutes. Well, that's not really much of a prediction, is it? Because even if he hadn't dropped Tyson Fury and given him problems, just swinging some big shots in the first few rounds, as big as Ngannou is, would have been enough for Gareth Davies to say, see, he was dangerous in the first few rounds. See those big shots he was swinging? Fury had to be on his game defensively to keep out of the way of those. You don't know what would have happened if one of those had landed. Give it a rest, Gareth. That fight should never have happened. Now, with regards to Anthony Joshua, and again, this is one of the reasons that Gareth Davies keeps bringing this up. You say, no, I'm not criticizing AJ for it because look, I didn't criticize Fury for it either. Yeah, if AJ would have been the one to take the fight first before Fury, I don't think Gareth Davies will be coming with this type of energy. I think he'd be more critical of AJ because Gareth Davies isn't necessarily an AJ hater. I certainly wouldn't say that, but he's a Tyson Fury fanboy without a shadow of a doubt. Well, because he defended Fury taking on Ngannou, he now necessarily must also defend Anthony Joshua fighting Ngannou in order to appear to be consistent. But of course, there are differences here. Anthony Joshua is not a world heavyweight champion. He's under no legal or moral obligation to fight the highest ranked, best available contender every time he steps out. Champions have certain privileges and power that contenders don't have. And with that power comes responsibility. Gareth Davies. You don't hold a contender to the same standard as a champion because a contender doesn't have the same privileges or the same power as a champion. Anthony Joshua fighting Ngannou doesn't hold the division up, does it? It doesn't stop anybody getting a title shot. Whereas Tyson Fury fighting Ngannou does hold the division up. It does stop people or delay people from getting title shots. This is why it's different. Anthony Joshua fighting Ngannou is a novelty fight. A contender taking on an MMA guy who, after his performance against Tyson Fury, has a bit more credibility. But this fight is still not as credible. And I'm talking about AJ versus Ngannou now. This fight is still not as credible as AJ versus Martin Bakole would be. Or AJ versus Frank Sanchez. Or AJ versus Filip Hrgovic. Or AJ versus Zhilei Zhang. Those are more credible fights because those heavyweights have done more than Francis Ngannou has done in a professional boxing ring. Ngannou's had one fight. The guys I just mentioned have been fighting for years and years and years, amateur and pro. So as I say, AJ Ngannou is a novelty fight. It's a fight that AJ is supposed to win convincingly. It's just that as a contender, he doesn't have to be held to the same standard as a champion because he's not in the same power position as a champion. And I was saying this before Fury fought Ngannou. In fact, I was saying this before Fury Ngannou was even announced or thought about I was talking about how champions need to be held to a higher standard than contenders. Because if a contender decides to take novelty fights or cherry pick opponents, in most instances, they are penalized for doing so. How? Because they don't maintain the same ranking that they would if they were fighting more legitimate opposition over the course of time. An example of that would be Agit Kabayel. Agit Kabayel beat Derek Chisora years ago. What was that, 5-6 years ago? And he received a relatively high ranking at the time, but because his subsequent opposition was so poor, he started to slip down the rankings. He only stayed in the top 15 because of the fact that he had the EBU title, which gives you, at least with some sanctioning bodies, a guaranteed top 15 ranking. So he was kind of languishing in maybe the number 13, 14 area for like the past 5 years. It's only when he fought Arslanbek Makhmudov and beat him, great performance by the way, that he went back up the rankings again. You see, contenders get penalized for fighting poor opposition. They don't maintain their position in the rankings. They start to slide down over time in most instances. There are some exceptions, of course, but in most cases, that's what happens. But of course, champions don't get penalized in that same way, especially if they've got a sanctioning body like the WBC who gives them carte blanche to be inactive, only sticks a mandatory on them once every 18 months or 2 years. And even then, it can sometimes be a very soft mandatory. An example of that would be when Deontay Wilder was WBC champion and he got Berman Stavern as a mandatory. Like, how on earth did that happen? Stavern had only fought once since their first fight, and that was against the journeyman in Derek Rossi. And somehow he gets made mandatory for Wilder. Crazy. So Wilder's got this position of privilege when he was WBC champion, where he's the A side against most people he fights, where he can cherry pick opposition and somehow keep hold of his title. Wasn't getting penalized. I mentioned in recent videos, look at Jamal Charlo at middleweight. He was out the ring for like 2 years and managed to keep hold of his WBC belt. Absolutely incredible. Another example was Adonis Stevenson back in the days. And look, I really liked Adonis Stevenson as a fighter. I love this style. He's one of the best one-punch knockout merchants to come along in boxing for a long time, Stevenson was. But at the back end of his career, he was in the WBC Witness Protection Program. He was fighting obscure opposition. The WBC were not putting serious mandatories on him. To be fair, he was relatively active, unlike, the likes of Charlo and what have you. But still, you look at guys like that, and then you understand why I'm so insistent that they fight the highest ranked available contenders when they make voluntary defenses. Because if the sanctioning body ain't going to do their job and give them good enough mandatories, then we, the public, have to apply the pressure. And so, to tie this all up then, bringing it back to the GAD, this is why we did not approve of the Ngannou fight, Mr. Gareth A. Davies. And I still don't approve of the Ngannou fight for Tyson Fury, him having taken that. No, that fight should have never have happened. Should have been Fury against Bacoli, Sanchez, even Makhmudov, who was highly ranked at the time. Not a guy who's never fought in a boxing match before. Some people talk about Fury wanting to fight Kabayel. Well, again, Kabayel proved himself in the Makhmudov fight. But understand, before that, he hadn't proved himself in like 5-6 years. He'd been fighting terrible opposition. So although he's now proved himself to be better than Makhmudov, prior to that, there was no reason, there was no justification for Fury to be skipping over the likes of Makhmudov, Sanchez, Bacoli, and taking on Kabayel, who was ranked like number 12 or 13. There'd be no justification for it. Now, of course, that Kabayel has earned a higher ranking, it makes him more viable. It makes it more justifiable, should I say, for either of the champions, Usyk or Fury, to take on someone like an Agit Kabayel as a voluntary defense. Because he's proven it. You don't give a guy credit, even as a contender, until he's earned the credit, until he's proved he belongs in a particular position. You can't be eating off a win over Derek Chisora that happened 5-6 years ago forever. That's absurd. You've got to build upon it or you slide down the pecking order, as was the case with Kabayel. So anyway, just wanted to get that off my chest with regards to Gareth A. Davies constantly saying, see, I was right about Ngannou and that's why I'm not criticizing AJ for fighting him. Give it a rest. We know what you're up to, Gareth. Presenting these things out of context. My take on Fury and Ngannou is if you play stupid games, you win stupid prizes. And that's what Tyson Fury got. He got a stupid prize against Ngannou where he ended up being dropped and his reputation was damaged after struggling against a debutante. The silly games were taking the fight in the first place rather than fighting legitimate established heavyweight contenders. It wouldn't have been so embarrassing for Fury if he'd struggled with a Martin Bakole or a Frank Sanchez, because they're actual boxers, not MMA guys. The reason Fury took on Ngannou instead of those guys is because he thought it would be easier. Regardless of what Gareth Davies was saying, Fury thought it would be easier. He thought it would be lower risk, higher reward. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Are you sick and tired of the mainstream mindset? Does the dogmatic conformity and pathological ignorance have you tearing your hair out in frustration? Then don't be alone. Come and join our brotherhood on Patreon. We stand as a beacon of reason against an army of insanity. You'll gain access to my weekly topical podcast, where we take more deep dives than Jacques Cousteau on an endless variety of subjects. There's also videos, interviews, live Q&As, as well as a vast back catalogue of previous episodes, including my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. You can listen via the Patreon app or download in high-quality MP3. Connect with myself and hundreds of other members in our Element chat group. There's no contract, no commitment, you can cancel at any time, and it's cheaper than a Mickey D's McMuffin. Just head to my Patreon page via the link below this video and select the tier called the Brotherhood of Reason. I'll see you over there.